You also had the opportunity to voice your questions regarding the use of AV tools to help with student learning. And your questions focused mainly on the use of audiovisual tools at Success Academy, different subject matters in which your peers had implemented audiovisual tools, concerns that you have voiced, negative things that could happen when you use audiovisual tools. So you were concerned about students being distracted or tools really not helping out when it came to learning particular topics. You asked your classmates about their experiences, and of course, you learned about that because of their responses to your forum questions, but also because of their own responses to the forum questions that we posed in terms of their experiences at Success Academy with audiovisual tools. And last but not least, you also asked particular questions about how your peers had implemented different audiovisual tools in different stages of the teaching and learning process. So I figured I would share with you some research-based ideas taken from the literature that help explain why is it that your students are so interested and pay so much attention and are better on retention when they learn using audiovisual tools. For example, the literature talks about how people learn from words and pictures, and there are a few principles. So basically, one thing to remember is that there are dual channels. People have separate channels for processing verbal and pictorial material. But we have limited capacity in terms of processing because we can only process a few pieces of information in each channel at any one time. And if you know, you've been through many experiences when you were getting input from two different sources and you can't pay attention to both the TV and the phone or the phone and the radio or things like that. So you've experienced those kinds of things. And also another principle has to do with active processing. So people learn better from words and pictures, but only if they engage in appropriate cognitive processing during learning that includes attending to the input, mentally organizing what they are learning about, and integrating it with what they already know that they have learned in the past. Now, there are different types of cognitive demands when people are learning. There is extraneous processing, and this has to do with processing that does not serve the instructional goal, so things that are really distracting to students. Essential processing, which is the type of processing that helps in building a mental representation of the presented material. And then generative processing, which is the processing aimed at making sense of the presented material. So when you design multimedia instruction, what you want to do is you want to eliminate extraneous processing. You want to aid essential processing or manage it. And you also want to encourage generative processing. And there are a few principles for reducing extraneous processing. For example, coherence is one of the ideas that you have to keep in mind. So you want to eliminate extraneous words and pictures. Sometimes as teachers, we feel tempted to include pictures in our PowerPoints because they look prettier and they get students interested. But if the picture is not related to the content, leave it out because you're really fostering extraneous processing, which is stealing away from the processing that needs to happen for students to understand the material. Anything that is distracting, not related to the content, the message you're trying to convey, leave it out. You also use signaling, so you highlight essential words and pictures. This is another thing that I've seen often in PowerPoints created by teachers where everything on the screen is a different color. And so there's no way that the student can tell what is important and what are details and what I should be focusing my attention on if everything is highlighted. You only highlight as in change the color, change the font size, font type, when you want to emphasize something in particular on the screen. Otherwise, you end up having what Horton, another instructional designer, talked about when he mentioned the Picasso effect. And the Picasso effect is when you're looking at a screen, but you're not necessarily getting the message out of it, you're actually staring at it like if it was a work of art because everything is so pretty on the screen. So you want to steer clear of that because as teachers, you want to send a message. And the message has to do with the content or the subject you're teaching and not you're not conveying a word of art that needs to be admired. Special contiguity is another principle for reducing extraneous processing, and it means placing the text next to the part of the graphic it describes. Admired only. The next thing is temporal contiguity. So present corresponding graphic and spoken text at the same time, and also redundancy. You want to present graphics with spoken words rather than graphics with spoken and printed words. And the final principle for reducing extraneous processing is expectation. So you should present a preview of the test items or the instructional objectives before the lesson. There's also principles for aiding essential processing. So the kinds of ideas and processing that you want your students to do in order to learn what you want them to learn. And one of the things is segmenting. So you break a complex lesson into manageable parts. You also want to do pre-training. So for example, when you teach vocabulary before you're teaching a lesson about a particular topic or names of or characteristics of key elements. And then modality. Present graphics with spoken text rather than printed text. Remember that people can only process so much, and if you present the same types of information on the screen at the same time, it'll take them longer to be able to process what you want them to understand. And then finally, there are principles for aiding generative processing. So you want your students to be able to do something about what they have learned in order for meaningful learning to occur. And so, for example, you want to use multimedia. You want to present words and pictures rather than words alone. And the idea behind this is that the minute you're presenting words and pictures, students are prompted to make an integration of what they're seeing on the screen, and that is a first step to being to the generative processing process where they make sense and make meaning out of what they're seeing on the screen. The next thing is personalization. So put words in conversational style rather than formal. And the last thing is voice. Use human speech rather than machine speech. The reason for these last two is that students will be able to connect more with a person and also connect more with somebody who feels like a partner in their learning experience rather than, say, somebody who is a machine. And that connection sparks the interest in doing something about what they have been learning. And that's what gets the generative processing started. On occasion, we don't have the opportunity to design media ourselves, but we can find media that we can use, and then we would have to evaluate it. And so I'm going to share with you a few rubrics that can help evaluate multimedia software, visuals, audio materials, and also video. And this can give you guidance in terms of the kinds of things you want to focus on when you're looking at media and trying to understand if it is going to be helpful for your own students.